ISCB Education Committee.
A piece of work that's been part of the ISCB Education Committee's activities probably for 7 or 8 years now. And the origins of this work go back way before that. I'm here on behalf of the Education Committee today, and there are several stalwart members of that committee who've been a constant presence throughout this long-standing project. But this work is actually the work of a much broader community of bioinformatics educators and trainers, and a few of them are represented here on my title slide. We've started meeting on an annual basis in a summit meeting, which is a meeting about getting work done together, and that's been tremendously fruitful. And so essentially what I'm going to present to you today is the culmination of the efforts that have gone into those summit meetings and the work in between over the past couple of years. And I am struggling to advance my slides. There we go. So I'll tell you a little bit about what the competency framework is and why the ISCB adopted a competency-based approach to education and training. I'll give you a quick tour of the latest version of the competency framework. This has been publicly released, but it hasn't been formally published yet. We're in the process of finishing off the paper that's associated with the latest version of the framework. I'll tell you a little bit about how you might use the framework to develop new learning interventions or to update pre-existing ones. And I'll tell you a little bit about our plans for the future. So first of all, what is the ISCB Competency Framework? Well, at its bare bones, it's a minimum information standard defining the competencies that are required and the levels that they're required at for bioinformatics professionals. It's also a tool to support bioinformatics educators to develop courses and curricula that meet the needs of their graduates and potential employers. And just to sort of go right back to basics, I thought it might be helpful if I defined what we mean when we use the word competency. So a competency is an observable ability of any professional, and it integrates multiple components such as knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes. We like it because its acquisition can be validated objectively. And we like it because it's applicable to learning of all types and at all career stages. And of course, in the ISCB, we have bioinformatics students, we have bioinformatics professionals at all stages of their career. And so we wanted to develop something that was meaningful to all of them. And so another term that we use quite a lot is the term professional. And I wanted to dig down a little bit and tell you what we mean by professional and which professionals are in scope for the ISCB, which types of professional fall under the umbrella of an International Society for Computational Biology. Over the years, whilst we've been developing the framework, we've come to sort of cluster different types of professional as either users of bioinformatics tools and services, as bioinformatics scientists, or as bioinformatics engineers. And each of these different types of professional comes in many different flavors as well. So a user might be someone who is applying science, but not necessarily doing curiosity-driven research themselves. So you might consider a physician to be a user of bioinformatics data and tools. You might also consider an ethicist or a lab technician or a biocurator or a conservation manager or an agronomist to be a user. They all have very, very different sets of skills, but in terms of the bioinformatics that they need, there are many commonalities there. Then when we look at the scientists, you might be a discovery biologist, perhaps working in an industrial setting. You might be an educator teaching bioinformatics science to others. You might be a kind of classical molecular life science researcher, doing curiosity-driven research, working on a particular system to understand the biology of that system in detail. Or you might be a little more service oriented. You might be a core facility manager or someone else working in a core facility. All of those people are using bioinformatics to either do or enable bioinformatics research. And so we classify them as bioinformatics scientists. And then finally, we have the engineers. And these are the people who really develop the underpinning computational infrastructure and the tools to enable bioinformatics science. So you could be a bioinformatician supporting a research group. That could be in academia, or it could be in industry, or indeed it could be in a healthcare setting or in another public sector setting. You might be a bioinformatician working in a research infrastructure, or you might be a software engineer with no background in the bio side of bioinformatics, but very, very strong software development, software engineering skills. And all of these types of professional are in scope. And so, as you can imagine, capturing the competency requirements for such a diverse group of people could be quite challenging. And we've had to work very, very hard at boiling it down to something that's both practically useful and manageable in terms of its size. One of the things that's helped us to do that is the development of personas. And we develop personas to identify and empathise with the types of bioinformatics professionals that the competency framework is built for. And again, this also helps us as bioinformatics education and training professionals to envisage the people that we're developing education and training for, and also capture the kinds of competencies that they need to develop to do their jobs. I wanted to give you a brief history of the framework. I mentioned at the very beginning that this is work that's been going on in earnest for 7 or 8 years. But actually, the whole project was really born out of frustration. And this started back in 1998 when Ross Altman articulated the need for a bioinformatics curriculum at an education committee meeting. And this was a meeting long before I had moved into bioinformatics, and I had no association with the ISCB or the field at the time. Although there are some people on the committee who do just remember those days. And if we fast forward a few years, the ISCB Education Committee had been giving this a lot of consideration, and they decided that they would gather information to support this process. So they did a survey, and they started to try to put together a pilot curriculum. And this turned out to be extremely challenging, because when they looked at the curricula that were out there, the descriptions of those curricula were not sufficiently meaningful to be able to compare one curriculum with another. And at that point, I had joined the ISCB, but not the education committee, and we started having a few kind of random conversations in the conference exhibition, in the coffee breaks, in birds of a feather sessions, and then there were a group of us that had started to attend the education committee meetings, and we got to thinking that perhaps we're looking at this completely the wrong way round, and perhaps instead of looking at the inputs into a course curriculum, what we need to think about is what the people coming out of those courses need out of the course. What competencies do they need to develop whilst they're undergoing those courses? And so that's what we tried to do. And version 1 of the competency framework was published in 2014, led by Lonnie Welch, who was co-chair of the education committee at the time. That framework was a list of competency requirements, very broad brush, and it was associated with 3 personas, and so we developed a persona for each of those broad categories that I showed to you earlier: the user, the scientist, and the engineer. And then a small number of trailblazers started to use the framework either to refine or update their pre-existing curricula, or to develop completely new curricula based on what we'd created. But at that point, I think the adoption of the framework was relatively limited to a small number of people who'd been quite heavily involved in its development. And in the process of doing that trailblazer work, we began to realise that the framework could be improved upon. That was no surprise, really. And if you look at competency frameworks developed for other professions, it's really par for the course that every 2 or 3 years you take a good, long, hard look at your competency framework and you update it according to what's changed in the field and according to alterations that need to be made in response to your user community. And so we started working on version 2, and one of the challenges that we had come upon at this point was that the 3 personas, the 3 different types of professional that we had worked on, were not blindingly obvious to the vast majority of bioinformaticians and others working in bioinformatics. And so we started pinning this down to the kinds of recognizable job roles that I showed you earlier, like physicians, discovery biologists, software engineers, to give this a much stronger grounding in recognizable professions. And of course, when you're dealing with a large number of different job roles, then it becomes obvious very, very quickly that not every type of professional needs every competency at the same level. And so at that point, we started to think about, well, you know, which competency level is appropriate for each of these different types of professional that we're incorporating. And so at that point, we started to use the Bloom's taxonomy, which is something that's familiar to educators, but not familiar to the typical bioinformatician. And I'll show you it later on, so that we could assign appropriate competency levels to each of the job roles. And then again, we've, you know, over the past 2 or 3 years, we've come upon a few additional bottlenecks. One is that although a growing number of people have been using it, we haven't really got a clear-cut set of guidelines to support people to use it. And so that's now work that's in an advanced stage of production, and we're hoping to be publishing it soon. But we have actually, in the last couple of years, had a fairly major overhaul of the framework and added a great deal of richness to it. And I'm going to show you some of that richness now. And the goal of all of this is really to support happy course providers to deliver quality training to happy learners who then make competent employees who either do or enable groundbreaking research with a positive impact on society. And so that is the goal, the purpose that all of this work is grounded in. And it really came out of the frustration that, you know, when this work was originally thought about, degree programs were not really producing the kinds of professional that employers wanted. So finally, I get to show you the latest version of the competency framework. And this is the kind of bare bones version of it. At its highest level, because this is a hierarchical structure, but at its highest level, it is simply a short series of statements. And each of those statements can be preceded by the phrase, "A competent bioinformatics professional can." And so I'm not going to read them all out to you. These slides will be made available to you later, and also the URL at the bottom will take you to an interactive version of the framework, and you're very, very welcome to go and have a play with that. But if you read through these, you'll see that really there's a set of competencies that speak more to the bioscience and scientific methodology. There are a couple that are really based in data science and in community standards. We then get into the more computational competencies, and finally we get into those kind of underpinning professional competencies, professional conduct. And this is a fairly major restructuring from previous versions, so that we've got that flow through, that logical flow through. And there are many other changes as well. So I'll run through those for you now. One of the things that we've incorporated is that data science and the FAIR principles, and also the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, have all increased enormously since we last updated the competency framework. And so we really wanted to make sure that we incorporated them into the required competencies for bioinformatics professionals. There's also been an awful lot of work going on in the background by other bodies, other organisations who have made use of the work that we had already done. And so particularly in the UK, the ISCB Competency Framework has been used to develop standards for advanced apprenticeships. It's been used to develop a national occupation standard, and both of those things put flesh on the bones of the competency framework by adding knowledge, skills and attitudes associated with each of the competencies. And so we've then been able to go back and make use of the work that others have done, incorporate many of the things that these standards bodies have put into their own frameworks, and then make those mappings transparent. So it's very, very clear both, where the work originated and what the cross-links are between them. And I think, with such a complex field that insinuates itself into so many different disciplines, it's very important that we do that, because not everybody who we work with in bioinformatics education and training will want to use the ISCB framework. They might have their own clinical competency framework that they want to work with, or their own engineers framework that they want to work with. And so we've kind of taken a leaf out of the book of the ontologies community here, and we try and make those mappings as transparent as possible. It was a huge amount of work to really dig down into what we mean by each competency in terms of the required knowledge base, the skills and the attitudes required to demonstrate each competency. And we've also further split the attitudes into effective attitudes and then ineffective attitudes, attitudes that prevent you from developing a competency, if you like. And I think that's quite helpful for individuals, because, as an individual, you can notice perhaps an attitude or behaviour that you're displaying, and having things delineated in this way helps you to develop as an individual. And sometimes it's about starting to do new things, but often it's about stopping doing things that you've been doing for a while and shouldn't be doing. Okay, so another kind of major philosophical change, I guess, or maybe not, more evolution than revolution, I would say, is that we really came to agreement that with regards to the framework, an individual is considered to be competent in an area if they display all the knowledge, skills and effective attitudes underlying each competence. And so this really is a minimal standard, if you like. To say that you have the competency, you have to have all of the underpinning knowledge, skills and attitudes associated with it. And then finally, as I mentioned, we haven't completed writing the paper yet, but we have made the framework itself publicly available so that others can make use of it. I wanted to say a little bit about the use of language, because I think this is another important change in the framework, and I'd really like to say thanks to Lee Larkham for his help with this. Lee is one of the people who worked on the UK National Occupation Standard and the apprenticeship framework, and he really helped us to use consistent language. And so this is where the idea of being able to preface each of the competencies with the phrase "a competent bioinformatics professional will," and then you can do the same for the knowledge, the skills, and the behaviours and attitudes. So for each of the knowledge statements, you can preface them with "a competent bioinformatics professional knows," and so on and so forth. So I mean that's helpful for us as the kind of curators and editors of the framework, but I also think it makes it much clearer for its users as well. I wanted to show you a few examples of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And so when we were writing these, we produced these grids. So for every competency, we've got a bunch of knowledge, a bunch of skills, and then the attitudes at the bottom. And we started out with a really, really long list for each of the competencies, and we have agonized over whittling these down to a manageable number, and really done that on the basis of what is the bare minimum that you need to have to be competent in this area. So, I mean, some of these areas for some competencies had, I don't know, 14 or 15 different statements that we had to boil down. And again, I won't read these, but if you go to the URL that I provided earlier, then these are all captured and you can browse through them at your leisure. I mentioned earlier that we started to use the Bloom's taxonomy to make statements about the level at which people require different competencies in different professional roles. And so I just wanted to show you what I mean by Bloom's taxonomy. We actually use the original Bloom's taxonomy. There is also a revised one, and we're considering using the revised one in future iterations of the framework. But the original one has these 6 different levels, and it starts with knowledge, essentially remembering previously learned information, and it goes through comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and finally to evaluation. And for each of these levels, Bloom's taxonomy has a number of different adjectives that are associated with being able to work at that level. And as educators, that becomes extremely useful when you are trying to develop assessments for your learners, for example. So, for example, if you want to find out whether somebody comprehends something, then you might get them to explain it to you. And so one of the adjectives that's associated with comprehension is explain. Okay, so one of the things that is should have become clear by now to you is that there are different levels of competency for different roles associated with the framework. And so the way we've developed this is essentially by extending our grid so that for each different type of professional, we can say, well, you know, this professional needs competency A at the application level, competency B at the knowledge level, and so on. I just wanted to give you a caveat here. With version 3 of the framework, this is work that is still in progress. And so what I'm showing you here doesn't necessarily reflect what's going to be published when we publish the paper, because this is still ongoing work. I'm purely using it for illustrative purposes. The other thing that you might notice if you stand back from this grid is that the level of expertise tends to travel in blocks. And I think this is, you know, I mentioned previously that we've reorganized the framework so that all the bioscience stuff is together and all of the engineering stuff is together. And so you can kind of see that when you apply the framework to different types of professional. You know, as you might expect, a bioinformatics software engineer needs to be at a higher level in the engineering competencies than they do in the bioscience competencies, whereas for a discovery biologist, it's the other way around. So this is not rocket science, and there are no surprises here. All of them need to be fairly competent in these generic professional skills. One of the pieces of work that we haven't done yet, but that's next on our horizon, is then thinking about how levels of competency might evolve with career stage. So here, if you were to compare, for example, an entry-level discovery biologist, someone who's just come out of their PhD or perhaps even out of graduate school, if you were to compare them with a senior discovery biologist, someone who'd been in the field for 5+ years, then you might expect that you might hope indeed, that in some of the areas of competency, their Bloom's level would have increased. And so this is something that we're going to be working on over the next phase of the evolution of the framework. And at this point, I'd really like to emphasize that this is a community effort. And if you would like to get involved in this work, I will give you some pointers at the end of my talk so that you can participate and help us to do this work. Okay, so that's all the theory. What can it actually be used for? Well, there are really two different types of use for the framework. I'm going to focus on how it can be used in education and training today, but it can also be used by employers and by their staff for professional development. And of course, the lines between these two things are a little bit blurred as well. For educators, you can use the framework to assess and redesign either complete degree programs or supplements to programs, or perhaps if you're involved in the kind of education and training initiatives that we're involved in at the EBI, you might be interested in using it to develop training resources that sit outside of the context of a full degree. So we run short courses, usually 3 to 5 days, that really focus on maybe one or even part of one competency area, and are really intended to be used as continuing professional development for people at many different career stages. And then we can also use the framework as the basis of new competency frameworks that have a computational biology element in them, but might also incorporate many other fields. And we've seen quite a bit of that going on, actually. So really for the educators, it's about designing and redesigning courses. For employers, you can use the framework to write job descriptions. You can use it as a career planning tool for individuals. You can use it to support the professional development of your team members. And perhaps at some point in the future, we'll do another webinar that covers those applications in more detail. But for now, I wanted to just give you a few hints as to how you might use the framework to either design or redesign a full-length degree course. And here I really have to offer massive thanks to many of my colleagues in the bioinformatics education and training community. This particular method that I'm going to share with you came from Bruno Gaeta, who is a long-standing member of both the Education Committee and the Board of Directors at the ISCB. Russell Schwartz has also done a lot of work on this. Nikki Mulder has done a lot of work on it, and many others have started to do so. And all of them already had degree programs of different flavours. And so the first thing that they did was to map a pre-existing curriculum to the framework. And this is one way of doing it. There are other ways as well. So one way is to simply lay out the competencies and then the modules or the individual courses within your degree programme. And then have a think about, for each of the modules or for each of the blocks of training, is a competency the main focus of a course? So is it intentionally covered in that course or module? Is it covered but not the main focus of the course, or is it not covered at all? So an example of where it might be covered but not the main focus is you might be doing a programming course or a programming module, and of course the main purpose of that course might be something like teaching people to program in Python, but there might be a group project as part of that course, and so that would also develop team working skills and some of these other generic competencies. And so you could put a 1 in a module like that for enabling people to work effectively in teams to accomplish a common goal. It's not the main purpose of that module, but it's something that is achieved. And really the idea here is not to, you know, do the maths and come up with a magic number for each of the competencies, but it's to use it as a thought experiment to guide you and others who are helping you to develop and deliver the course, to figure out where any gaps might be, and also to figure out what might be rejigged to actually make it easier to teach. It could be that you've got some competencies smeared across multiple modules, and you might find that you're suffering from an excess of overlap in modules, and by reconfiguring things, you might be able to tidy things up a little bit, perhaps reduce contact time a little bit, and make your curriculum flow a little bit more freely than it is doing at the moment. So so don't see this as an exact science. It's a way of just getting a very, very quick and dirty picture of what's missing, what's good, and how you might reorganize things a little bit more logically. When we come to designing a course from scratch, particularly if it's a long course leading to a professional qualification, then we would advocate using something like Nichols' cycle for formative assessment. So you start this cycle by identifying who your target audience is. And so, you know, you might be developing an undergraduate course for biochemists, and within that, you might be developing a module on bioinformatics or on data science. So first of all, identify who your target audience is, and you can make use of the roles or the personas in the ISCB framework to do that. The next stage is to identify what their learning outcomes need to be. And here again, you can define learning outcomes that are relevant to the competencies that are needed by the role. So the framework has this nice grid with the competencies and each of these different roles. If one of those roles is your intended target audience, or someone qualifying to enter one of those roles is your target audience, then you've already got that list of competencies that they need to develop, and you can hang your learning outcomes on that information. The next stage is to select the experiences that will raise the competency of the individuals that you're going to be teaching. And I would suggest here that you think about raising them from a predefined prerequisite level to the Bloom's level needed in the role. And you want to avoid massive leaps. You're not going to go from Bloom's level 1 to Bloom's level 6 in one fell swoop. You need to do this in manageable chunks. And so that will also help you to predefine what the prerequisite qualifications are for somebody entering your course. And then you can tailor the experiences to someone who already has that prerequisite competency and needs to come up to the competency that you're aiming for in your learning outcomes. And then it's not until that point that you identify the content. And often as course providers, we've all done it. We do this the other way around. We think about, okay, what do I know? What can I teach? You create your content around that, and apologies, and then you try and work backwards. And we're advocating that you don't do that. We're advocating that you start with the target audience and that you use the framework to make this logical flow through to defining the content that you need to include in your course. Once you've got that content, and you might have to write that content yourself, or you might be able to source that content from elsewhere. You might, for example, be able to source it from the Goblet training portal, or the Elixir training e-support system, or from your colleagues if you're working with faculty who run related courses, or from papers and textbooks. Once you've got your content, you need to identify the kinds of assessments that you will create so that you can check whether your learners have achieved the relevant competency. And there, again, you want to choose assessments that are appropriate for the target Bloom's level. And this is where looking at the adjectives that are associated with each of those Bloom's levels and assessing appropriately comes into play. And then finally, you want to do some evaluation. Now, if you're developing a completely new course, if you've got time, it makes a great deal of sense to run a pilot. If you haven't got time to do that, then of course you have to leap in with your degree program. And whether you're doing either of those things, you will expect to iterate on the basis of whether your learners have successfully passed their assessments, the feedback that you get from them, and ultimately whether they are able to go into the roles that you were aiming for them to go into. And so evaluation can actually be a long, drawn-out process. And you may have to iterate through 2 or 3 cycles of a course before you really hit the sweet spot. And of course, by that point, the field's changed, and you're going to have to start amending your course program anyway to reflect changes in the field. So this, don't think this is a once-only process, because it's not. It's something that as learners and educators we have to do time and time again. So I've described the kinds of processes that you might go through if you were developing lengthy degree programs, but that's not what I do, and it's not what my expertise is in. And everything that I've presented in the last 2 slides has come from my other colleagues in the education committee. I have a little bit more expertise personally in developing short self-contained courses. And so here are a few considerations if you want to use the ISCB Competency Framework for those kinds of courses. First of all, if you're assessing a pre-existing short course, you might want to consider selecting one especially relevant competency and then really looking at the content of that course in light of the individual knowledge, skills and attitudes that we've now defined in version 3 of the framework. And then you can really do a sort of mini version of this grid and figure out whether you're missing any KSAs, and whether you, in your current version of the course, whether you're really supporting the development of the whole competency. And then you might want to tweak your course content accordingly. I would also really advocate managing your own and your learners' expectations, because what I said for degree programs is probably even more true in short courses. You're not going to shift your learners more than one level on the Bloom's scale. So set your course prerequisites accordingly. You know, if your trainees are going to be learning how to do single-cell RNA-seq analysis, for example, you might want to ensure that you're working with people who already know how to program in R, because if there's R-based data analysis in your course, you don't want to have to stop and teach them R, when really the objective of your course is to teach them how to analyze single-cell data. So think about setting your course prerequisites so that you're not being over-ambitious. And then also your assessment and evaluation may need to be done through long-term feedback surveys. Most short self-contained courses don't have exams at the end of them. And also it would be pointless having exams at the end of them, because your learners need to go away and do these analyses for themselves in their own research setting. And figure out how to do this in their own time and in their own context. And so the best way of doing your evaluation, if you're following the Nichols cycle, is to catch up with them a few months or even further down the line, and to ask them what the impact of the training was on the research that they're doing. And this is especially true if you're focusing on skills and behaviours rather than on building someone's knowledge base. You can really only assess, and they can only assess, whether they've developed those skills and behaviours if they've gone back and used them in the field. Okay, so there may be some people in the audience who have already mapped their courses to previous versions of the framework. And so here is a handy little tool for those who've done that. And I would like to say a big thank you to Tom Hancock's in my team for putting this diagram together. We've been doing a lot of work on being completely transparent about how the framework has evolved since it was first published, because it has evolved quite quickly. If you're still working with version 1, this is a diagram that will help you to map your existing content to the new competencies, even if they've been split, or if new ones have been added. Obviously you're going to have to remap because there's nothing to work with. But you know, things have been split, they've been merged, they've been renamed, they've been archived, and so this is your guide. The other thing I should mention is that in the competency hub that I provided the URL to earlier, we have got detailed release notes that explain the rationale behind all of these changes. And then when you use the competency framework itself, these mappings are captured in the competencies. So for the version 3 of the framework, you can see if there is a closely related competency in version 2 or in version 1. So the mappings are all there, and you can travel in time from version 1 to 3 and back again if that's what you need to do to do your to remap your course. So do take a look at the competency framework here for all of that richness. And finally, I just wanted to say a few words about what's next. So we are in the throes of completing the mapping of our long list of professional roles to the Bloom's level for each competency. And once that work is done, we're hoping we'll be in a position where we can then publish version 3 of the framework in a peer-reviewed journal. The associated paper is in a fairly advanced stage of writing now, and Nikki Mulder, one of my co-chairs on the committee, is leading on that process. We're also planning to publish guidelines for using the framework, and we're going to incorporate some real life use cases into those guidelines. So that will be a set of much more comprehensive instructions on how to map your pre-existing course, how to develop a new course. Some of the tips and tricks that I've hinted at today in a much more comprehensive form. And Russell Schwartz is working on that, and Bruno Geiter is helping us get together the real life use cases. And at that point, I think we will say version 3 of the framework is wrapped up, and we will, at some point in the not too distant future, start gathering feedback on what then needs to be added when we start to develop the next version. This is a bit like painting the 4th bridge. As soon as you get one version of the framework out, you really need to be thinking about what's going to go into the next one. One of those things I've already hinted at, which is thinking about career progression within an individual role and providing guidance on the Bloom's levels required at those different career stages. And as I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to help us with that, we would really, really like to hear from you. And then the ongoing work, of course, to extend our mappings to include other related frameworks. There are some new frameworks coming out in data science, for example. There's a lot of work going on at the moment in clinical bioinformatics. There are some groups of agronomists who are starting to think about bioinformatics competencies and how they relate in their field. So we can start to extend to include some of those mappings. And then just a couple of words about how the ISCB is planning to encourage the adoption of the framework. There are 2 new schemes that we're hoping to be launching later this year. One of those is a course endorsement process. So higher education institutes will be able to apply to the ISCB to have their degree granting grants endorsed, and that process will require a demonstration that the learning outcomes and the curriculum itself map to the ISCB Competency Framework. And we're in the process of developing tools that will enable you to do that as part of the application process. And actually Seth is heavily involved in that work. And then there's a related project, the Course Affiliation Project. This will enable providers of short bioinformatics courses to affiliate their courses with the ISCB. A similar scheme has been available for conferences for some time, and the affiliation process is going to require demonstration that a short course addresses at least one of the ISCB competencies. So that's why you might want to map one of your short courses to a single competency and make sure that it does a comprehensive job of meeting those competency requirements. So that's all for the future, and I think at some point in the next year we'll be running another webinar to explain these things in more detail. And finally, how can you get involved? I've mentioned that we'll soon be looking for input on our reference personas, on the competencies that they need at different levels of their, at different stages of their career. So there are a number of things that you could do if you'd like to get involved in this work. If you're either not already a member of the ISCB, or if you are already a member of the ISCB, we strongly encourage you to join our COSI, our community of special interest. And the URL for joining that COSI is there. This is quite a big community now, and it's a community that has given us a lot of support to get as far as we have with the competency framework. If you are already a member of the ISCB and you're interested in education and training, and you haven't yet participated in education committee activities, then you are very, very welcome to participate. Any member of the ISCB can join the Education Committee. We're an open committee, and the URL for the committee is there. There's a mailing list that you can join. When we're not in lockdown, we have one face-to-face meeting a year at ISMB, but we're also planning a virtual meeting before ISMB this year. So there'll be a message going out to the mailing list about that before too long. And then, of course, we will have our regular get-together and our education and training session at ISMB in July. And then, as well as the activities that we run at ISMB, we regularly hold education sessions at ISCB and ISCB affiliated meetings. And competency discussions are often on the menu in those sessions. They're often not the only thing, but they're nearly always there in some form or another. And we've run a number of workshops introducing the framework to people and getting them to get their hands dirty and to map their own courses to it in those education sessions. So if you have a regional group, ISCB Latin America or INCOB, for example, then do consider coming along to the education sessions at your regular regional conference. And all of those are advertised on the ISCB website. With that, I would like to offer my thanks to everybody who has participated in this work. I know I haven't captured you all here. This has been a huge community effort. But this is, I think, the majority of the real stalwarts and the participants in the two bioinformatics education summits that we've run to date. Thank you all, and looking forward to working with you and a broader community to develop this further in the future. And with that, I will shut up, and I'll be very happy to answer questions if we're able to do that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cath. It was a very good explanation. It's very interesting to see how it's evolved into what it is. So we do have some questions for you. First one's coming from chat, from Dr. David Martin. He says, the framework is a great piece of work, but is both broad and deep. It's hard to see how a degree course can cover all of it. What does accreditation look like at the honors, master's, or even PhD level?
Okay, so one thing that I would say is that you don't necessarily have to cover all of it. When you see the mappings for the different types of professional, which is very, very hard to fit on a single slide, I have to say, then you'll see that there are actually big gaps in there. So I would say focus on those areas that are most highly relevant to the kinds of professional that you're trying to train. And also, you know, at undergraduate level, you don't necessarily have to go to vast amounts of depth in all of these things. There are there's another way in which you can use the framework to create specialist streams. So, for example, if you run a generic bioinformatics master's course, you're trying to teach everything to reach every competency level to a sort of working knowledge level. It's quite a big ask, but you can figure out what things are common to all of the all of those professionals, and actually a lot of that lies in these generic professional skills, and focus on those things, and then have modules or electives that enable people to develop in, perhaps in a more engineering related direction, or in a more data science related direction, or so you can think about, what things are common to absolutely every type of professional that you're targeting. and then focus on non-essentials for others. Sorry, that was a very waffly answer to an eloquent question. I hope it answers the question.
I think it got hit the major points. So we have another question here from Jim Proctor. He says, for a point of clarification, when you mentioned using long-term methods like follow-ups and surveys to evaluate and assess short courses, was that for assessing design evaluation, or was it to assess whether a learner had achieved a change in their competency?
With the long-term surveys, you can do a little bit of each, actually. I mean, primarily when we send out our long-term surveys, and by we, I mean the EBI, but I also mean Elixir, because we've tried to standardize our long-term surveys. So any of the Elixir nodes would be probably thinking along these lines. You want to encourage people to assess whether or not they have been able to do something different, something that they couldn't do before they went on the course. And so we ask a small number of questions to try and get at that. In the surveys that we run immediately after a course, we focus more on perceived quality and balance. So, you know, one of the questions that we regularly ask is about the perceived balance of theoretical versus practical work and whether we got that right. So neither of those things is really testing whether someone can do something new. We're not giving them multiple choice questions. We're not just testing their knowledge base, but we're asking them to assess whether it was useful, whether we got the balance right and the course design right, and then whether they feel able to do the thing that they came along to the course to enable them to do in the first place.
Makes sense. So if anyone else has any more questions, feel free to write them either in the chat or the question window, the Q&A window, to give them some time. For version 4, which, as you said, you were looking at potentially another Bloom's taxonomy, what would be your objective? What goal do you want to see come from version 4?
I think the main thing in version 4 is going to be more transparently enabling people to use the framework as a career development tool. So and as a tool for employers. To date, we've really focused on the education setting and developing curricula that will prepare graduates for the world of work. But to me, the next most logical step, once we've achieved that, is to move it into how you can progress in the world of work, and using the competency profile for individuals' career guidance to enable employers to write appropriate job descriptions, and to also enable people to shift careers if they need to. And one of the things you can see when you use a competency framework is that it helps to develop people who have a very nice high-level understanding of all of their field. They might not have it all in depth, but they've got enough to be able to have sensible conversations with their peers in other fields. And so being able to use the competency framework as an assessment tool for that, and driving people towards those gaps that are that might perhaps be stopping them from developing as a well-rounded professional, I think would be my next goal.
Fair. That would be a very useful tool for many burgeoning bioinformaticians.
Well, I think it then also starts to encompass some of the work that the careers working group at the ISCB has just started work on, and I've always seen that there's a bit of overlap between those two things, and I think this is where we would really be able to synergize very nicely with that group.
Excellent. Well, it looks like that is all of our questions for today. So once again, thank you very much, Cath, for a great talk. Oh, and right as I say that, another question popped up. Never mind. Do you plan, or are you thinking of a longitudinal curriculum mapping in terms of education of students as they advance in the different stages of their education?
I think the short answer to that question is no. But if that was something that you wanted to do, then I would definitely encourage you to reach out, and we could talk about how you might do that.